watch the game, you don't see Busquets. But if you watch Busquets, you see the whole game. A popular and constantly repeated quote by Vicente del Bosque. And while this quote has probably been completely overused, there is some definite truth to it. Players like Sergio Busquets are often widely overlooked when it comes to who's the best player in X or Y team type debates. There's just something about that deep-lying midfielder / pivot / regista role that leads to players very easily going unnoticed if they're doing their jobs right. And I mean, when you have players like Lionel Messi up top doing things like this, I guess it's not hard to see why. And when it comes to Michael Carrick, there's unfortunately no exception. When thinking of Manchester United's great 2008 Champions League and Premier League winning team, who comes to mind? You're probably all thinking Ronaldo, Rooney, Tevez, and quite frankly, you have every right to do so. But Carrick started 31 games in the league that season, completing 1,585 passes, averaging an 80% tackle success rate, assisting twice and scoring twice. And when you think about the underachieving English sides from the late 2000s and the early 2010s that were crying out for a player with a combination of creativity and defensive solidity, he was nowhere to be found. He wasn't even selected for the 2008 and 2012 Euros, as well as the 2014 World Cup. But why is that? Was Michael Carrick, dare I say it, underappreciated? Let's talk. And while we're at it, let's also answer another question. How good was Michael Carrick really? Yo, what's up everyone? Trust you're all doing well and having a great day. In today's episode, we'll be taking a look into the career of perhaps the last true deep-lying playmaker to play for Manchester United. For today's video, we'll be briefly covering his footballing journey as per my other How Good videos, but we'll also be paying close attention to his tactical utilization throughout his career. Be sure to leave a like if you like the content, as it massively helps the channel out, but only if you want to though. Really sorry about that, but I mean, this is YouTube after all. Anyway, let's get right into it. Born in 1981 in Wallsend, Michael Carrick began his footballing journey at the age of 5. Coming up from the famous Wallsend Boys Club, he actually started out as a centre forward. In those days, he was known to be quite mobile and was able to effortlessly drift around the pitch. That all changed in his late teenage years. Growing up in Newcastle, Carrick was an avid Newcastle fan, and understandably, he had aspirations of one day playing for Newcastle United. However, by the time he was 15, that unfortunately wasn't an option for one reason or another. For that reason, he was off to West Ham to progress his development. Only problem was that he experienced a quick and sudden growth spurt. I'm talking 20 centimeters in a very short period of time. As a result of this, he began to suffer through a slew of knee-related injuries and found it hard to retain the mobility he once had. Despite this, his passing ability remained consistent. Thus, he chose to build on it. And in doing so, he made the transition from life in the centre forward position to life as a central midfielder, a decision that paid dividends very soon after, as he was part of the West Ham youth side that won the FA Youth Cup in the 1998-99 season. As a reward, a first-team debut followed the very next season, and after 2 short loan spells, he became an integral part of the West Ham setup, alongside Rio Ferdinand, Frank Lampard, Joe Cole, and many more. Yeah, West Ham was a bit of a hot pot for some of the best youth footballers back in the day. Between 2000 and 2004, Carrick played in almost every league game for West Ham, and even after they were relegated to the Championship in 2003, he stayed with them for another season. But when you're as good as he was, that just won't do. Speaking briefly on his abilities, which we'll be covering in detail later on, Carrick was a gem. He wasn't tremendously athletic, no thanks to a sudden growth spurt which forced him to switch up his playstyle, but his footballing mind was incredible. Harry Redknapp even recalled that during one of Carrick's loan spells to Swindon Town, he was even described as the nearest thing to Glenn Hoddle, a massive compliment to be sure. The passing range, the interceptions, the perfect tackles, the positional awareness, it was all there. Although, despite his 6'2" frame, he would sometimes be scrutinized for not being physical enough. However, with the way that he played, this didn't really matter. Tottenham Hotspur was up next, beating several other Premier League sides to Carrick's signature for £3.5 million in 2004. He was 23 years of age when he signed for them. Although there was a bit of confusion over whether the manager, Jacques Santini, actually wanted him or if the board went over his head to purchase him. This suspicion was all but confirmed when Carrick failed to even be selected for the matchday squad for the first 8 games of the season. All the same, when Santini was sacked shortly after Carrick arrived and Martin Jol came in, Carrick not only began to start, but he was also a crucial member of the squad, operating in more or less the same capacity as his time at West Ham. And after 2 seasons at Spurs, he'd done enough to force the hand of Manchester United and Sir Alex Ferguson. They made him their 5th most expensive signing of all time at that point in the summer of 2006, signing him for £18.6 million. 5th most expensive after Rio Ferdinand, Wayne Rooney, Juan Sebastian Veron, and Ruud van Nistelrooy. At this point, I know what you're thinking. One of those names stands out more than the others, perhaps the best player in Man United's long history. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if you guys thought I was going to be referring to anyone else here. There was only ever going to be one option. Moving along, now that we've gotten to his time at Manchester United, most likely the main reason that some of you clicked on this video, we're going to switch up the formula a little bit. Instead of doing a play-by-play of his seasons at United, we're more or less going to laser in on his contribution to the team from a tactical and positional perspective throughout his time at Old Trafford. So, first things first, why was Michael Carrick brought into United in the first place? Roy Keane had only just left United after falling out with Sir Alex Ferguson one season prior to Carrick joining. Through no fault of his own, an immediate comparison was made between Keane and Carrick as a result of this. The fact that Ferguson gave him Keane's old number 16 jersey didn't really help that much in this regard. With Keane, we had steely determination, leadership, a never-say-die attitude, an undying midfield engine, hard tackles, aggression, physicality, all that and much more. With Carrick, although he shared many of these traits, several just weren't part of his repertoire. So, if he wasn't a like-for-like replacement for Keane, why did United stick their neck out for him? Well, the answer to this is simple, but not so simple. In the words of Sir Alex Ferguson, in the modern-day game, you don't need tacklers the same way you used to. There's just no call for it. It's about anticipation and reading the game. Taking that quote into consideration, as well as everything else that's already been stated in this video, who comes to mind as the perfect player to fill this role? Carrick was the type of player that was more adept at pressing spaces rather than pressing players. An important concept. Making interceptions and reading the opposition's plays well before they got the chance to complete them. His awareness of what was going on around him in both attack and defense was perhaps unmatched. A highly noticeable trait of his on the pitch was his tendency to constantly survey his direct surroundings even when out of possession. Knowing where all his teammates were at all times was imperative to how he conducted himself on the pitch. It was important that he knew exactly where he was going to offload the ball well before he received it himself. To anyone that's played the midfield position before, even at the most basic level, you'll instantly recognize that these characteristics are amongst the first things that you're taught, if you had a decent coach that is. I guess that's part of what made Carrick so special. He was able to do the basics very proficiently at the highest level there possibly is. Okay, so let's move on to his tactical deployment in his first few seasons at Manchester United. United played mostly in a 4-4-2 in the league, but switched it up to a 4-2-3-1 or a 4-3-3 on occasion, most notably when playing in the Champions League. There were several reasons for this. However, the most glaring would be the fact that most English teams were still using the 4-4-2 formation at the time. The same can't be said for the rest of Europe. Big teams in Europe, even to this day, tend to pack their midfields with bodies to enforce high possessional play and overwhelm the opposition with midfield overloads. In the 4-4-2 that Man United played in, Carrick typically played as the deepest of the two midfielders. In his role here, he acted as the midfield screen, sitting directly in front of the defense at the base of the midfield. With a wide view of the entire pitch in front of him, he was able to dictate the flow of the game, spraying passes all around the pitch and marking the opposition out the game through his incredible sense of anticipation. In a 4-3-3, he did more or less the same thing, however, he was more than likely placed in the central center midfield position, flanked by two highly mobile midfield engines. In that sense, his playstyle shared many similarities with that of a regista. For anyone unfamiliar with this role, in a few words, a regista is a deep-lying player that is essentially primarily a playmaker. They play in the defensive midfielder position, but defending is certainly not their speciality, in comparison to other midfielders at least. Think Pirlo at Juventus, Jorginho at Napoli, or even Xabi Alonso to an extent while he was at Liverpool and Real Madrid, but more so at Bayern Munich. You'll probably notice that all these players I've just noted are either Italian or Spanish. There's a reason for that. The fast pace of the English game and the love for quote-unquote all-action midfielders that want it more means that a player like a traditional regista would almost never successfully make their way through the English youth system. This is where Carrick set himself apart. He made it out. And briefly going into his defensive abilities, as I've already stated, he wasn't the most physically dominant player around, but that didn't mean that he was incapable of getting his hands dirty. In reality, he was an accomplished ball winner with great timing of his tackles and decent jumping ability, so much so that he successfully filled in at centre-back from time to time. Alright, so before we go any further, I think it's important that I get this out the way now rather than later. Michael Carrick was not Paul Scholes. While they were both incredible passers and both had the ability to dictate the game, they fulfilled different roles over the course of their careers, and thus were completely different players. For example, Scholes started off as a striker and slowly but surely was moved further and further down the pitch until he was more or less deployed in the deep line position towards the end of his career. And while his playstyle on the ball was something more akin to a more continental player at the time, much like Carrick, his physicality and defensive playstyle was very English indeed. Hard in the tackle, sometimes reckless. He possessed a high attacking work rate as well as a high defensive work rate up until the later years of his career. Here lies the key distinction between the two. Carrick was a specialist in this deep-lying position over his entire career. While he was always a hard worker in defense, his attacking work rates were never nearly as high. But that's not to say he was afraid of getting forward. In his own words, if you can get on the ball and support the attack, then go for it. But be aware of where the danger lies if the move breaks down. So now let's get into some key stats over the course of his career to really showcase what kind of a player he really was. During his Premier League career, he made 481 appearances in the league, and after making a total of 18,978 passes in those appearances, he achieved a pass completion rate of 87.9%. In comparison, Steven Gerrard and Frank Lampard averaged 83% and 82.6% completion rates in their careers, respectively. In addition to this, Carrick made an average of 1.5 tackles per match with a 70% tackle success rate. Not the highest in comparison to more bullish tacklers like Javier Mascherano for Liverpool, John Obi Mikel for Chelsea, or Gareth Barry for several clubs, with 5.4, 2.1 and 1.6 tackles per match, respectively. I only make the comparisons as these were just some of the starting deep-lying midfielders for their clubs around the same time that Carrick was still active. Even still, Carrick's numbers were highly efficient. In terms of interceptions, we see more of the same, just very solid numbers overall, with 1.2 interceptions per match, compared to 2.6 for Mascherano, 1.6 for Mikel, and 0.96 for Barry. Having said that, in terms of the fouls he committed, his stats were noticeably quite low over the course of his career with 0.35 per match. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that he also received 0 red cards in the league throughout his entire career. Compare that to the 4 that Paul Scholes received, for example. And finally, he picked up 24 goals and made 40 assists. Not the most useful stats for this analysis, but I felt inclined to mention them nonetheless. If you've seen some of my other videos, you already know that I tend to approach stats for anyone other than attackers with a bit of caution. Long story short, for defenders and midfielders, stats sometimes tend to paint an inaccurate picture of a player's performance. If you fail to keep a clean sheet or are overrun in the midfield, it's entirely possible that it's not your fault, despite what the stats may say. You could very well have had a good game, but to anyone that only looks at the post-match stats, their perception may not reflect that. If you're a striker and you score a winning goal but otherwise had a bad game, their perception is the exact opposite. Maybe a debate for another day. In any case, this snapshot of Carrick's career provides good insight into the value and level-headedness that he brought to the team in his tenure. Now, at this point, you may be asking, but what about the English national team? Good question. For this discussion, it's quite difficult to back up any claims that he could have improved the team with data and statistical evidence. In addition to that, at the time, and looking back in hindsight, it's very hard to argue against the selection of players like Steven Gerrard and Frank Lampard, especially considering the fact that England have more often than not played with a two-man midfield in the past decade or two. Having said all of that, he only made 40 appearances for the national team, of which a whopping 1 was in a major tournament, in the first knockout round of the 2006 World Cup. Funnily enough, this was the lineup for that match. Not sure how it didn't catch on, if I'm honest. He wasn't selected in the 23-man squad for the 2008 Euros, the 2012 Euros, or the 2014 World Cup. Although, he was selected for the 2010 World Cup, but was an unused sub for each and every single match. Considering that it can be heavily argued that Carrick was the best deep-lying English midfielder in the past decade or two, it's a real shame that he never got more of a chance to prove himself on the international stage. All in all, after retiring from the game altogether in 2018, he still managed to have an extraordinary career, appreciated, underappreciated, whatever you want to call it. 5 Premier League titles, 1 FA Cup, 2 League Cups, 1 Club World Cup, and finally, the 2013 Manchester United Players Player of the Year. At the very least, his own teammates appreciated his contributions. Despite this, and perhaps even after watching this video, many may not fully acknowledge what he did during his playing days. And even though we can all look back at his abilities and marvel in hindsight, his playing career itself undoubtedly represented that of an overlooked genius. And there we have it. I'd be very interested to hear what you guys think about Michael Carrick. Where do you think he ranks, not only in terms of the Man United squads that he played in, but also the English midfielders of his generation? Feel free to leave your comments below. Had a lot of fun making this one and really hope you guys enjoy it. Anyway, that's all from me today. Wishing you all a fantastic day ahead. Cheers, and I'll catch you in the next one.